My name is Isla Bennett, and I'm 32 years old. When my husband told me to apologize to another woman or face divorce, something inside me went utterly still. Mason stood in our living room, arms crossed, like a man delivering a performance review, not an ultimatum. "Apologize to Scarlet," he said, "or we're done." He had that look again, the calm superiority that always made me question if I was overreacting. The same expression he wore when my instincts tried to surface, and he buried them under reason and tone. Behind him, the evening light from the kitchen window painted a sharp rectangle across the floor, slicing the room in half, like a moral line neither of us could see, but both of us had already crossed. He didn't yell. Mason never needed to. His voice was firm, patient, threaded with disappointment, as though he were the rational one trying to manage his unstable wife. "Scarlet's been nothing but kind to you," he said. "You've been distant and cold. You hurt her feelings." I stared at the man I had married and thought, "You have no idea how much truth you've just handed me." But before I tell you how I decided to give him the apology he demanded, I have to take you back to where the cracks began. Mason and I met at a summer barbecue. He was near the drink cooler, laughing with a group of friends, when he looked up and smiled like I was already a familiar memory. That day was all heat shimmer and lazy conversation. 3 hours on back porch steps, talking about our work, about books, about what we wanted from life. He listened the way people in movies listen, intent, almost reverent. When he asked for my number, I didn't hesitate. 2 years later, we married under a canopy of string lights and wildflowers. Small ceremony, handwritten vows. I remember his voice breaking when he said, "You make everything make sense." I believed him. Our first home was a 2-bedroom apartment with uneven floors and good light. I freelanced as a graphic designer. He worked at a logistics firm downtown. We shared dinners, weekend experiments in cooking, quiet laughter about burnt risotto. I thought we were building something solid. Then, one night, 6 months into marriage, Mason came home glowing with excitement. "Scarlett's moving back to town," he said, dropping his briefcase. "You'll love her, my best friend from college." I smiled, genuinely. I'd heard the name before, tucked inside stories of road trips and late-night debates, the kind of friendship that sounded harmless. But when I finally met her, I understood how a single name could rearrange a room. Scarlet Pierce was luminous in a curated way, perfect hair, tailored suit, laugh designed to linger in the air. At dinner, she leaned close to Mason, finishing his sentences like they'd rehearsed the choreography for years. Her husband, Elijah, sat beside her, quiet and deliberate, eyes cataloging every movement the way I was. I told myself I was being paranoid. People can share history without crossing lines. But the first boundary fell quietly, the night Scarlett texted Mason during our movie date. Then again, then again. By the time the previews ended, Mason had sent 12 messages about a presentation she was nervous for. He apologized each time, swore it would stop, yet the pattern took root. Her name lighting his phone, his hand always reaching. Weeks later, I came home to find Scarlett barefoot on our couch. She smiled as though she belonged there. "Mason gave me a key," she said lightly. "Wi-Fi emergency." Mason appeared from the kitchen, 2 mugs of coffee in hand, utterly at ease. That night, when I asked if we could talk about boundaries, Mason sighed like a weary teacher. "She's going through a hard time, Isla. Be compassionate." Compassion. That word became his shield. Every time I flinched at a midnight text or a spontaneous visit, he held it up like proof of my inadequacy. I began measuring my sanity against his calm tone, wondering if maybe love really did mean never questioning. Our 5th anniversary came on a Tuesday. I booked a table at Meridian, the same restaurant where we'd celebrated his last promotion. I wore the emerald dress he once said made my eyes look like sea glass. Mason smiled when I stepped out of the bedroom, but kept glancing at his phone on the drive there. We hadn't even finished our appetizers when the buzzing started. "It's Scarlet," he murmured, thumbs already moving. "She's having a rough day." I stared at the candles between us, at the reflection of his face illuminated not by firelight, but by a screen. "Mason," I said softly, "it's our anniversary." He looked up, confused, almost surprised that I'd spoken. "I'm just letting her know she's not alone." But I was alone, sitting across from my husband while he comforted another woman through glass and signal. The irony pressed against my chest until I could barely breathe. That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. Somewhere between one inhale and the next, a realization settled with surgical precision. Our marriage had 3 people in it, and I was the least important. I tried to swallow it, to fix it. I told myself I was imagining things, that adult friendships could look like this. But love built on denial is a house with invisible cracks. You don't see them until the walls shift. 3 months later, the shift came. My laptop crashed during a major client deadline. Mason had told me I could always use his, so I grabbed it without thinking. It opened easily, no password, no warning, no reason for suspicion, until my cursor hovered over a folder named Personal Private. 2 words that should never coexist in a marriage. I hesitated, breath shallow. Maybe it was work material. Maybe it was surprise gifts. Maybe curiosity was the real betrayal here, but the air felt thick with premonition. I clicked. Hundreds of files, photos, screenshots, timestamps, Scarlet's laughter frozen in pixels, Mason's hand on her shoulder in a restaurant I didn't recognize, texts that began innocently, then unraveled into late-night confessions about roads not taken. Every word a small incision carving out the truth I'd been too polite to claim. In one thread, Scarlet wrote, "Sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if we'd gotten together instead of staying friends." Mason's reply came minutes later, more often than I probably should. It felt like falling through ice, silent, absolute. For a long moment I just sat there, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. Then something inside me crystallized into focus. I copied every file, every screenshot, every receipt into a new folder labeled Truth. By the time Mason came home that evening, dinner was on the table, music low, everything staged exactly as he liked it. He kissed my cheek and said, "You okay?" "Of course," I said. "I was just thinking about that apology you wanted." His shoulders loosened in relief. "Good. I knew you'd come around." I smiled, gentle, harmless. "Let's make it official. I'll do it at Scarlet's house, with Elijah there. A proper apology." Mason's grin broke wide, triumphant. "Really? You will?" "Absolutely," I said, already planning the stage on which he'd watch his world burn. The word fine left my mouth with calm precision, but what I meant was finally. Finally, I saw everything clearly. The next morning, the apartment felt unnaturally quiet. Mason left for work at 7:02 a.m., right on schedule, his kiss brushing my forehead like a ritual that no longer meant anything. The moment the elevator doors closed behind him, I sat at his desk and turned on his laptop again. The screen lit up fast, as if eager to confess. My own reflection hovered over the glow, a woman both terrified and certain. I opened the folder labeled Personal Private, and this time I didn't just glance. I studied. The first images were restaurant photos. Scarlet and Mason sitting at a small corner table, a vase of white tulips between them. Her hand resting casually near his, their bodies leaning inward in the universal language of intimacy. The restaurant name glowed faintly on the wineglass. River Bend Cafe. I'd never been there with him. Scrolling through the dates, I noticed a pattern. Every image was taken on a Tuesday around noon. The timestamps didn't lie. Week after week, the same setting, same faces, same secret. My stomach knotted. I opened Mason's browser and checked the bank statements for our joint card. Each Tuesday, like clockwork, charges between $50 and $70 at Riverbend Cafe. A perfect rhythm, so consistent it almost looked innocent if you weren't looking for it. I clicked through his digital calendar, a recurring 2-hour block labeled simply lunch meeting. No client names, no details, just a small gray rectangle repeating endlessly across months, years. He had hidden the affair not with lies, but with ordinary habits. I kept digging. Inside a subfolder titled Keepsakes, there were screenshots, hundreds of them, conversations spanning years. The earliest ones were harmless, jokes about college professors, inside references I didn't understand. But as I scrolled forward through time, the tone shifted. Compliments became confessions. Lines blurred and then disappeared. "Sometimes I miss who I used to be," Scarlet wrote. "You mean before you settled?" Mason replied. "Before I stopped feeling alive." I exhaled slowly, like trying not to disturb a wound. Further down, he'd sent her an article about emotional compatibility. Her reply, "You always know exactly what to send me." His response, "Maybe that's because I still know you better than anyone." There it was, the truth I'd felt for months but couldn't prove. The messages weren't sexual, they were worse. They were the kind of exchanges that built intimacy brick by brick, all under the guise of friendship. Emotional infidelity, the invisible kind that leaves no lipstick stains, only absence. I checked his email. Buried among work receipts were 3 that froze me in place. A Nordstrom order, a silk scarf, $250, a wine boutique purchase, Chateau Lafleur, $180, a flower delivery service, $75, with the message, "So proud of you. Always knew you could." He had celebrated her milestones while forgetting our own. I printed the receipts one by one. The pages slid out warm, smelling faintly of toner, each sheet a small paper betrayal. By noon, the desk looked like a crime scene of affection. Photos, receipts, messages, proof. The kind of evidence no courtroom would need to believe what I already knew. Still, I felt something unexpected. Calm. Not the numb calm of shock, but the kind that comes with clarity. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't jealous. I'd simply been right. For months, Mason had turned my intuition into the enemy. Now I had data, timestamps, transactions, logic to match emotion. But logic alone doesn't heal. It just sharpens the pain. I sat back in the chair and let the realization unfurl. This wasn't a one-time lapse or harmless closeness. It was a system, maintained and nurtured in secrecy, structured into his life like a standing appointment. He'd built a second marriage inside ours. The air in the room grew thick. A single question echoed, "What now?" I could scream. I could confront. I could pack a bag. But each choice felt like performing his script, reacting instead of directing. If I was going to burn this illusion down, I wanted to control the match. I spent the next hours documenting everything properly. I created folders named by year and subfolders by month. I labeled each screenshot chronologically, tracing the progression from catching up to confessing. I highlighted the keywords in each thread: miss, regret, connection, if only. Words that told their own story. Then I exported everything to a USB drive. Actually, 2 drives. I hid one in the lining of my old camera bag, the other in the bottom drawer of my art supply cabinet. Old habits from my design work. Always keep backups. Never trust one file. It was nearly 3 p.m. when I realized I hadn't eaten. The smell of stale coffee hung in the air. On Mason's desk sat a small framed photo of us from our wedding day. His arm around me, his eyes soft. I picked it up, stared for a long time, then set it face down. If I'd learned anything from years of editing design projects, it was that truth is often in the layers. Strip away the polish, the filters, the angles, and the raw image emerges, ugly but real. At 3:47 p.m., I opened Mason's contacts and found Elijah Pierce, Scarlet's husband, the quiet man who had shared my bewildered glances across dinner tables while our spouses laughed at memories we didn't belong to. I hesitated with my finger over the call button. This was the moment that divided before from after. If I pressed it, there'd be no going back. The phone rang twice. "Hello?" Elijah's voice was steady, slightly formal. "Elijah," I said, forcing calm. "It's Isla Bennett, Mason's wife." A beat of silence. "Is everything okay?" "I'm calling because Mason arranged for me to come to your house this Saturday to apologize to Scarlet. He insisted it happen in front of both of you. I just wanted to make sure you'd be there." Another pause, longer. I could hear him exhale slowly. "I'll be there," he said. No questions, no surprise, just quiet recognition. "Good," I replied. My throat tightened. "And there are some things you should know before then. Things you might have sensed but never saw." The weight in his voice changed. "I understand," he said softly. "Thank you for calling me." When the line disconnected, I sat there staring at my reflection in the dark laptop screen. My pulse was steady, my decision was final. That evening, when Mason came home, I was chopping vegetables, the air filled with garlic and olive oil. He kissed my cheek, looked relieved that I seemed calm. "How was your day?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Productive," I said. "I've been thinking about Saturday, about what I'll say." His face brightened instantly. "I knew you'd see reason. Scarlet's really grateful, you know. This will mean a lot to her." I smiled faintly, turning back to the cutting board. "I bet it will." He started humming, content. He thought the apology would heal everything, that I'd bend, the way I always had. But while he poured wine, I watched his reflection in the kitchen window. The man who once promised me truth, now framed by evening light, holding a glass of red like a toast to his own delusion. He believed Saturday would save him. He didn't know it was the stage of his undoing. Saturday arrived, dressed in calm deceit. Clear sky, warm light. The kind of day that pretends nothing can go wrong. I woke early, brewed coffee, and moved through the apartment in silence while Mason hummed in the shower. Every movement was deliberate. Laying out my navy dress, checking the USB drives again, reading through the notes on my phone. Mason believed my quiet meant nerves. He kissed my shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," he said, proud. "Scarlet will see how mature you're being." I smiled faintly, watching his reflection in the mirror. I'm sure she will. By 5 o'clock, I was ready. Mason had selected the wine himself, a French vintage he could barely pronounce. He slipped it into a silk-lined gift bag, all tissue paper and pretense. "Peace offering," he said, tying the ribbon. He didn't see my hands shaking, not with fear, but with restraint. We left at 6:15, driving through suburban streets that looked almost staged in their normalcy. Kids on bikes, sprinklers misting lawns, sunlight catching the edges of maple leaves. Mason talked the entire drive, rehearsing his fantasy of reconciliation. "She's so relieved you agreed," he said. "After tonight, everything will finally be back to normal." Normal. The word scraped against my chest like sandpaper. He reached for my hand as we turned onto Scarlet Street, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I love you, Isla. You know that, right?" "Of course," I said softly, staring out the window. "That's why we're doing this." Scarlet's house appeared ahead, perfectly symmetrical beneath a pink-orange sky. All the windows glowed. Inside, shapes moved, shadows preparing for performance. Mason parked in the driveway, exhaled deeply, and smiled at me like a man about to win something. "Ready?" "Always." He rang the bell, even though we could see Scarlet approaching through the glass. She opened the door with the confidence of a hostess welcoming guests to a celebration she'd already won. Her perfume, something floral and expensive, floated between us. "Mason, Isla!" she exclaimed, all warmth and light. "Come in. I'm so glad we're doing this." I stepped inside. The house smelled of vanilla candles and fresh flowers. The living room looked ready for a magazine shoot. Wine glasses filled, a cheese board arranged with surgical precision, napkins folded perfectly. Scarlet had dressed for the occasion. Cream silk blouse, jeans that cost more than my entire outfit, every strand of hair in place. Elijah entered quietly from the kitchen, carrying an extra chair. He nodded once to Mason, once to me. But when our eyes met, there was something there, a readiness, a shared understanding. He knew what this evening truly was. We settled into a perfect formation. Scarlet and Elijah on the sectional sofa, Mason and I in the armchairs opposite them. Between us, the coffee table gleamed under too bright light. Scarlet folded her hands in her lap, smiling with practiced grace. "Isla, before you start, I just want to say thank you. It takes a lot of courage to admit when we've been wrong." Mason nodded approvingly, eyes full of expectation. I set the wine bag gently on the table, then met Scarlet's gaze. "You're right," I said, "and I do owe you an apology." Her smile widened, eyes softening with victory. Mason leaned forward slightly, like a coach watching his player deliver the winning speech. "But," I continued, letting the word rest heavy between us, "not for the reasons you think." The air changed. It was subtle at first, like the room itself had taken a breath and decided to hold it. Mason's smile faltered. Scarlet blinked, confusion flickering in her eyes. Elijah's posture shifted. He leaned forward, arms resting on his knees. I kept my tone calm, deliberate. "I owe you an apology for staying silent when I should have spoken, for pretending not to notice an emotional affair happening right in front of me, for allowing my husband to convince me I was crazy, for seeing the truth." Mason's voice sliced through the tension. "Isla, what are you—" I raised a hand without looking at him. "You wanted me to apologize," I said. "Let me finish." Scarlet's color drained slightly. "Emotional affair?" she whispered. I turned to Elijah. "You deserve to know the truth long before tonight. Mason and Scarlet have been meeting every Tuesday at Riverbend Cafe for the last 2 years. They exchange late-night messages, confessing regrets and fantasies about what life would have been if they'd chosen each other. I have the receipts, the texts, the photos." From my purse, I pulled my phone, already open to the folder I'd titled Truth. I placed it on the table and slid it toward Elijah. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. The glow from the screen illuminated his face in soft blue light. He began scrolling slowly, reading each message, his breathing changing rhythm with every swipe. Mason stood abruptly, voice tight with panic. Elijah, don't! She's twisting everything. She broke into my private files. Elijah didn't look up. How long? He asked, voice quiet but sharp enough to cut glass. Scarlet's lips parted. It's not what you think. How long? Her answer broke in a whisper. 3 years. Elijah's expression barely changed, but something deep in his eyes hardened. So I wasn't crazy, he said softly. Mason tried to step closer, palms out, the universal gesture of control. Elijah, please. Nothing physical ever happened. We were just close. Elijah turned the phone toward him, reading aloud one of Mason's texts. I think about what life would have been like if we'd been together more often than I probably should. He looked up, his voice trembling with contained fury. That's not friendship, Mason. Scarlet was crying now, quiet tears smearing her mascara. It was never supposed to be like this. We just understood each other. No, I said softly. You needed someone to make you feel alive, and you both chose married people to do it. Mason's face twisted, red blotches creeping up his neck. You came here to humiliate me. I met his eyes evenly. No, you asked me to apologize for speaking truth. I just did. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Elijah set my phone down gently, every motion precise. I'll send this to myself, he said to me quietly. You have my email? I nodded. Already did. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw gratitude beneath the devastation. Scarlet stood abruptly, knocking over her glass of wine. Get out, she choked, tears streaking her cheeks. Both of you, just get out. Mason tried to reach for me, but I stepped back, shaking my head. Don't, I said. You've done enough reaching for things that aren't yours. The silence that followed felt biblical. 4 people, 4 ruined illusions. I picked up my purse, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward the door. The air outside hit like clarity, cold, clean, final. Behind me, voices rose, Elijah's steady fury, Scarlet's sobs, Mason's desperate explanations. None of it mattered anymore. The night smelled of rain that hadn't come yet, electric and sharp. I stood on the porch, looking up at the windows glowing from within like little squares of false warmth. Inside, Mason's world was collapsing in real time. I didn't smile, I didn't cry, I just breathed, deep, certain, free. The apology was complete. Mason didn't come home until almost 2 a.m. I'd been sitting on the couch with a half-empty glass of wine, watching the clock crawl forward. When his key finally turned in the lock, I didn't flinch. I wanted to see his face. He looked ruined. His eyes were red, shirt wrinkled, hair in disarray, the mask of composure completely gone. For a long moment, he just stood in the doorway staring at me, chest rising and falling. Then his voice came out cracked, raw. How could you do that to me? I set my glass down carefully. Do what, exactly? Humiliate me like that, he said, pacing now. You destroyed 2 marriages in one night. You shared private messages that no one was ever supposed to see. You violated my trust, Isla. You went through my files. I almost laughed. Your trust? You mean the same trust you broke every Tuesday at Riverbend Cafe? He ignored that, running a hand through his hair. You don't understand. Scarlet and I, we connected emotionally. That's not a crime. You twisted everything to make it ugly. The words stung, but not the way he intended. I realized he still thought this was about misunderstanding, not betrayal. I didn't twist anything, I said quietly. I just turned on the light. Mason exhaled sharply and sank into the armchair across from me. You've always been dramatic, he said. Always looking for betrayal, even when there isn't any. I was patient for months, trying to help you work through your jealousy. But tonight, you went too far. It was astonishing, really, how he could still shape a narrative where he was the victim. I studied him the way a scientist studies a specimen. Detached, curious about the reflexes of denial. He kept talking, voice climbing and falling in rehearsed rhythms. You ruined Scarlet's marriage. Elijah's devastated. You've turned everyone against me. Are you proud of yourself? I waited until he ran out of words. Yes, I said simply. For the first time in months, I'm proud of something I've done. That stopped him. His mouth opened, closed. Then he shook his head slowly. You've lost your mind. No, I said. I found it. He stared at me, uncomprehending. Then the rage cracked into something desperate. He crossed the room, knelt beside the couch, grabbed my hands. His voice softened. We can fix this, Isla. I'll delete everything. I'll end contact with Scarlet. We'll go to therapy. We can rebuild. The touch of his hands felt foreign. like contact from a stranger. I pulled back. You're not listening. There's nothing to rebuild. You demolished it piece by piece. He sat back on his heels. You're serious? I'm filing for divorce. The words hung between us, clean and absolute. For a heartbeat, he looked stunned, as if he hadn't considered that consequence was real. Then came the pleading phase, the frantic gestures, the cascade of apologies that meant nothing, because they arrived after the house had already burned down. He spent the next hour cycling through the stages of loss. First denial, then outrage, then tearful bargaining. I didn't move from my spot on the couch. By the time exhaustion hit him, he muttered something about sleeping on the couch, grabbed a blanket, and collapsed into silence. I sat awake long after his breathing evened out. The apartment smelled faintly of wine and smoke from a candle that had burned too low. I stared at the ceiling and felt nothing but an odd peace, the kind that comes when a long storm finally ends. By Tuesday morning, I was sitting in the glass office of Victoria Brennan, a divorce attorney recommended by a colleague. Her office was sleek, chrome accents, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the kind of view that made even heartbreak look manageable. Victoria herself was composed, mid-50s, sharp eyes that missed nothing. She gestured for me to sit. Tell me everything. I did. The photos, the messages, the receipts, the confrontation. She listened without interruption, fingers tapping quietly on a digital tablet. When I finished, she leaned back, assessing me with the calm precision of someone who's seen every version of betrayal imaginable. Emotional affairs are tricky, she said finally. They're not always recognized legally the way physical ones are. But what you have, Ms. Bennett, is a pattern. Repeated contact, concealment, financial transactions, emotional intimacy. Courts understand patterns. She paused, scrolling through the images I'd emailed her. These are thorough. You documented everything chronologically? Yes. Good. That tells a story. We'll file under marital misconduct with emphasis on emotional infidelity and gaslighting behavior. He'll probably counter with claims of privacy violation. Standard tactic. We'll preempt it by noting that you discovered the evidence accidentally while using his laptop for work. You acted reasonably once you saw what you saw. I watched her write notes with efficient strokes. He'll say I'm jealous, I murmured. Let him, she replied briskly. Gaslighters always weaponize the word jealous. The evidence speaks louder than his narrative. Her certainty was strangely soothing. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was sitting beside someone who couldn't be manipulated by charm or tears. When our consultation ended 2 hours later, she shook my hand. From now on, she said, you let me be the bad guy. He can direct his anger at me. Your job is to stay calm and document everything. Understand? Completely. I left her office lighter than I'd entered. Outside, the city air was sharp and cold. People hurried past, each carrying their own private battles, invisible to strangers. For the first time, I didn't feel alone among them. That night, Mason tried a different tactic, the nostalgia phase. He cooked dinner, played our old playlist, even lit candles. We were good once, he said softly. Remember that? I nodded. We were. We could be again. No, I said gently. We were good because I didn't know what was real. He swallowed hard. You're really going through with this. Yes. He leaned back, the flicker of candlelight catching his tired face. You know, he said quietly, you're going to regret it. No one else will ever love you the way I did. I met his gaze. That's the point. He looked away first. When I went to bed, I closed the door and locked it. Not because I was afraid of him, but because the sound of that lock sliding into place felt symbolic, a boundary sealed. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the city lights flicker. Somewhere out there, Scarlet was probably replaying the same night in her mind, trying to justify it to herself. Elijah was likely packing a bag, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. 4 lives detonated in one evening, and yet for the first time, I felt weightless. I realized then that truth, once spoken aloud, doesn't need defending. It just echoes until every lie runs out of air. The papers were filed the next morning. I signed them with steady hands, sealed them in an envelope, and placed it on the counter. The simple act felt sacred. That sound, the envelope sliding across wood, was the cleanest closure I'd ever known. 2 weeks after I filed for divorce, an email arrived from Elijah Pierce. The subject line was simple: thank you. I hesitated before opening it, half expecting anger or blame. Instead, the message was brief and steady, like its writer. Isla, I filed on Monday. I spent years trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, that Scarlet's friendship with Mason was harmless. Your apology gave me proof and peace at the same time. I owe you more than you know. If you're open to it, I'd like to buy you a coffee, not for closure, but for gratitude. Elijah. I read it 3 times. Gratitude. Such a small human word after so much chaos. I typed my reply carefully. Wednesday, 2 p.m., Haven Cafe downtown. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and quiet forgiveness. I spotted Elijah immediately. Same calm presence, though the lines around his eyes looked deeper now. When he saw me, he stood, managing a small, genuine smile. Isla, he said, it's good to see you under better lighting. We both laughed, a sound neither of us expected. We ordered coffee, sat by the window, and for the first time since that night, we talked without tension. No pretense, no performance, just 2 people comparing maps of the same storm. Elijah described years of subtle humiliation, the way Scarlet's phone would light up at midnight, how she'd say Mason just needs advice, how his discomfort was labeled insecurity. I thought maybe I was the problem, he admitted, stirring his coffee. She convinced me that jealousy was weakness, that real love meant total trust. I nodded. Mason said the same thing. He told me compassion was more important than boundaries. Elijah looked up, eyes steady. Compassion without boundaries is self-destruction. The words landed deep. We talked for nearly 2 hours, about gaslighting, about the slow erosion of certainty, about how easy it is to lose yourself when someone rewrites your perception of truth. When we finally stood to leave, he said softly, it's strange. The night everything exploded, I thought my life was ending. Turns out it was just beginning differently. I understood completely. Over the next few months, our paths crossed often, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Coffee turned into walks into conversations that stretched past sunset. Nothing romantic at first, just the rare comfort of being understood without explanation. Meanwhile, Mason and Scarlet tried to turn their secret into something sustainable. Mutual friends whispered updates I didn't ask for. They'd moved in together, then out again, then back in. They were trying to make us into them, to prove their connection had been worth the destruction. But reality doesn't feel like fantasy once you turn on the lights. Scarlet had imagined emotional intensity would translate into lasting love. Mason believed that validation could replace integrity. Neither was right. 4 months later, word reached me that they'd broken up. No grand drama this time, just fatigue. Mason couldn't tolerate Scarlet's constant need for reassurance, and she grew resentful of his diminished finances after the divorce. Their bond had thrived on secrecy and guilt. It withered in daylight. I thought that would bring satisfaction, but it didn't. Just confirmation. What they called connection was really escape. My own life grew quieter in contrast. I reclaimed the apartment, redecorated room by room. I sold the dining table Mason insisted on and replaced it with one small enough for 1 or 2. I painted the walls warm gray, hung art I loved. Every change was a small act of resurrection. I worked late again, not because I was hiding from pain, but because I enjoyed creating. Projects flourished. Clients noticed. My first major contract came through, a design campaign for a travel company. I built something that was mine alone. The silence at night no longer felt hollow. It felt earned. One evening, while sorting through old papers, I found a printed screenshot from the folder labeled Truth. It was the message where Scarlet wrote, "Sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if we'd gotten together instead of staying friends." I stared at it for a long time, then fed it to the shredder. The sound, steady, mechanical, felt like closure. Elijah and I continued our weekly coffees. Over time, our conversation shifted from survival to possibility. He talked about rebuilding his accounting firm's client list, how he was considering teaching part-time. I told him about my growing freelance studio, about how freedom and fear sometimes shared the same heartbeat. We discovered mutual quirks, both obsessed with old films, both hikers who preferred trails without crowds. We started sharing recommendations, books, movies, places worth seeing alone. One Wednesday in late spring, he said, "Coffee feels too routine. Dinner instead?" I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because the word instead carried weight. He noticed my pause and smiled gently. No expectations, just new context. I exhaled and nodded. Dinner sounds good. The restaurant was small, Italian, candlelit, but not pretentious. We talked for 3 hours straight, about everything except Mason and Scarlet. That omission felt like freedom. When the waiter cleared our plates, Elijah leaned back, studying me for a moment. "You seem lighter," he said. "I am," I admitted. For a long time, I thought peace would come when Mason apologized, but it came when I stopped waiting for it. He smiled, quiet understanding in his eyes. That's when it comes for most of us. Outside, the night air was soft and full of city sounds. We walked to our cars without awkwardness, without pressure. When we said goodnight, he didn't reach for me. Just a steady, respectful look that said, "We're not broken anymore." And maybe that was better than any promise. Sometimes healing is so quiet you don't notice it happening. It hides in the spaces where pain used to echo. It shows up in morning light, in silence that doesn't ache, in laughter that returns without being forced. I saw Mason once during that period, across a parking lot outside a grocery store. He was loading bags into his car, thinner, older somehow. He saw me, smiled faintly, lifted a hand in greeting. I nodded back, no bitterness left, no need for words. That brief exchange was all the closure either of us would ever need. By summer, Elijah and I had built an easy rhythm. Wednesday dinners replaced coffees. We still kept our boundaries clear, giving healing the time it needed. Neither of us wanted to repeat the cycle of rushing into closeness born from pain. He once said, "It's strange how truth destroys and restores in the same breath." I thought about that for a long time, because that's exactly what it did. It destroyed the version of myself that apologized for seeing too much, and it restored the woman who no longer needed permission to trust her own eyes. On the anniversary of the confrontation, almost to the day, I lit a single candle in the apartment. No ritual, no bitterness, just acknowledgement. The flame flickered gently, steady but alive. I realized then, peace doesn't always arrive quietly. Sometimes it walks in through the wreckage, unapologetic, carrying the same fire that burned everything down. 6 months after the night of the apology, I sat in Victoria Brennan's office signing the final divorce papers. The room was all glass and sunlight. The afternoon sky spilled through the tall windows, lighting the polished conference table where neat stacks of documents waited. My name appeared, again and again, each signature a small liberation. Victoria watched with her usual composed half-smile. "You did well," she said. "He agreed to a fair split. Apartment remains yours, and he'll cover half the legal fees. I suspect he wants it over quickly." "Because of Scarlet," I guessed. "Because he's embarrassed," she corrected. "Men like Mason don't fear loss. They fear exposure." I almost smiled. She wasn't wrong. When I signed the last page, Victoria extended her hand. "Congratulations, Ms. Bennett. You're officially free." The word free lingered in the air like perfume. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt clean. I gathered the papers, slid them into my leather folder, and walked out into the brightness of downtown. The city noise rushed around me, car horns, snippets of conversation, the soft rhythm of people moving on with their lives. For the first time in years, I felt part of that rhythm again. Freedom didn't roar, it exhaled. Over the next few months, the remnants of my old life faded quietly. Mason transferred his half of our savings, packed his things, and vanished into a small studio across town. Occasionally, an envelope from his lawyer arrived, polite and procedural. There were no more midnight arguments, no half-hearted apologies. The silence in my apartment transformed. It stopped echoing like absence and began humming like peace. I repainted the living room white, bought new curtains that let in morning light, filled shelves with books I actually loved instead of titles meant to impress. The couch where Mason had once rehearsed his defenses was replaced by one I chose for comfort alone. There were no ghosts left in the furniture, just space. Every morning, I brewed coffee and stood by the window watching the city wake. No phone buzzing, no performance to maintain, just quiet and caffeine and sunlight. My weekly dinners with Elijah continued, but they evolved into something gentler than romance, deeper than friendship. We never labeled it. We didn't need to. Some evenings we talked about work, sometimes about nothing at all. Other nights, we'd end up on long walks through side streets lined with old brick houses. The conversations wandered. Books, music, memories. Once he said, "You know, it's strange how healing looks like boredom at first." I laughed softly. "Because peace doesn't perform." He nodded. "Exactly." We both understood what it meant to rebuild without the need to prove anything. There were no games, no control battles, just presence. One afternoon in late autumn, I ran into Mason at the grocery store. It had been nearly a year since our divorce. I was reaching for a bag of apples when another hand brushed mine. We both looked up, startled. He looked smaller somehow. His suit jacket hung loosely. The sharpness that once defined him had dulled. His hair had more gray, his eyes less certainty. "Isla," he said, his voice quiet. "Hey," I nodded. "Hi, Mason." We stood there for a moment. Two people who used to share a life, now reduced to strangers navigating the fruit aisle. "How have you been?" he asked. "Good," I said truthfully. "Busy with work. Life's simple." He hesitated, shifting the apples in his hand. "That's good. I wanted to say I'm sorry." I looked at him closely, measuring the sincerity. His shoulders slumped, his gaze clear but tired. "For everything," he added. "For how I handled it. For not listening. For making you feel crazy when you weren't." There was no satisfaction in hearing it, just an acknowledgement of something long overdue. "I appreciate that," I said quietly. He nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Scarlet and I didn't work out." I didn't ask why. I already knew. He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Turns out fantasy doesn't pay rent." I offered a faint smile. "No, it doesn't." For a brief second, the silence between us wasn't hostile, just empty, neutral, complete. Then he glanced at his cart, muttered a polite goodbye, and walked away. I watched him disappear down the aisle and realized the strangest thing. I felt nothing. No anger, no nostalgia, no ache, just calm. That's when I knew I was done healing. Weeks passed. Elijah and I met for dinner again at the same little Italian place where we'd first stepped out of survival and into something new. He told me about a promotion. I told him about a gallery interested in my design prints. Halfway through the meal, he said, "Do you ever think about that night?" "The apology?" He nodded. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not with regret, more like gratitude. That night broke everything open." He smiled softly. Some truths have to explode before they can heal. Outside, the first snow of the season had started to fall, flakes catching in the glow of the streetlights. We walked out together, our breath visible in the cold air. At the corner, he paused. "Dinner next week?" he asked. "Always," I said. Back home, I lit a candle on the windowsill. The flame danced, reflected in the glass, one small light in the dark city. I thought about Mason, about Scarlet, about the lives that had imploded and reformed. Somewhere out there, they were probably both learning what happens when illusion meets reality. And I thought about myself, the woman who once whispered apologies for noticing too much, who now spoke truth without fear. There's a peace that comes only after the fire, when the ashes settle and you can finally see what survived. The lesson had been brutal, but clear. Never force an apology from a woman who tells the truth, because when she finally gives it, it will burn through every lie around her until only honesty remains. Mason wanted submission. What he got was revelation. And I got my life back. Sometimes I replay that final moment in Scarlet's living room. The hush before everything shattered. The way truth sounded when it hit the air. It wasn't rage, it wasn't vengeance, it was freedom, spoken aloud. Now, when I wake each morning and sunlight fills the apartment, I don't think about what I lost. I think about what I reclaimed. Peace, self-respect, and the courage to stand in my own clarity. The silence that surrounds me isn't emptiness anymore. It's space for new beginnings. And in that quiet, I've learned the simplest, most powerful truth of all. You don't heal by pretending it didn't happen. You heal by making sure it never happens again.